So, there's been this question everyone's been whispering about, is having a boyfriend actually embarrassing? Like, are we still doing that in 2025? Public displays of affection, red flag. Matching profile pictures, prison. But seriously, is having a boyfriend embarrassing, or are we just coping? So, with that being said, let's talk delusion, dependence, and dating dynamics. You're listening to Delusional and Exhausted. I am your host, Jada, where I overthink everything so you don't have to. So, the reason why I brought up this question is because there's been a lot of swirl due to an article published in British Vogue by CHANTÉ Joseph titled, "Is Having a Boyfriend Embarrassing Now?" And the article was published in 11 regions, made headlines, and sparked a global debate across several social media platforms. The biggest one, I'd say, TikTok, is how I came across it. But originally, I did find it on my Instagram feed from BritishVogue, which I follow. Anyways, it made me really question, is having a boyfriend embarrassing? Like, what are we doing, you know? And in CHANTÉ Joseph's recent TikTok, she explains how the idea of being single feels much more attractive and appealing. And the reason why I think that's very interesting is because we live in a heteronormative society where men, not saying all men, but most men get away with so much, and women don't exactly get the same grace for that. And in turn, the behavior that men display feels icky. And to be with a man, it's embarrassing that way because, especially when there's no solid alignment to how they fit into your life or into your values, there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of gray area, if you will. So, what we tolerated as before, as a Gen Zer myself, I believe that previous generations that have come before me would tolerate some of the behaviors that we see today as normal or tolerable, or something that maybe women before me would be like, okay, like this isn't ideal, but I'm just gonna go with it, you know, even if it's not something that is appealing to women, you know? And what we tolerated as normal before with interpersonal relationships with men has shifted now because women as a collective have gained more consciousness as to what they will and will not tolerate. And I think that's something that's very liberating to see, especially as someone still navigating their 20s and figuring out, you know, how do these relationships work? How do I navigate relationships, especially as a heteronormative woman? It is very spooky, it's very scary. I know it's not Halloween anymore, but it's still a little spooky, I'm not gonna lie. So after reading the article, I have some main points that really stuck out to me that I'd like to share with you guys, because what would I be without facts, right? So, from what I gathered, CHANTÉ dislikes how women's online personas often become centered around men when they bring around like their boyfriends, for example. And it's a pattern that we see so much in social media, like, oh, you know, boyfriend reveal, or come with me and my boyfriend to X, Y, and Z. I'm not saying those things are negative or not entertaining, but historically, women were socially and financially rewarded for publicly displaying relationships, especially on social media. And so recently, since there's been a shift, instead of fully showing or hard launching partners online, many women now post subtle or obscured hints of relationships, like a hand or a drink or a shadow, even. Like, basically, if you don't know what that is basically soft launching your partner, but not in an obvious way, but slightly, so that the audience has some sort of idea, like, oh, she's with someone, or, you know, mystery man, mystery partner, whatever the case may be. So, with this article coming out, I believe it started this more urgent trend that reflects tension. You know, women want to share parts of their romantic lives without letting their identities become defined by their partners. And I think that's a very pinnacle point, because many times there are instances where women feel overshadowed by a man, and this can be applied to, you know, the workplace, or just in society in general. Like, men are seen as the leaders and the women follow behind. And what I'm trying to translate in a media perspective is that when women show men off, like in their videos, it takes away from the woman in a way. Like, it's not totally centered on the woman anymore. It's more so a shared spotlight, if you will. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, but it changes the identity of what is portrayed in content and in media. And so what I also found interesting was the personal perspectives that CHANTÉ provided. And what I think it's really important to mention is that it's not all about the image and what we see. CHANTÉ did a call out on Instagram where plenty of women told her that they feared that they would be given the evil eye, you know, a belief that their happy relationships would spark jealousy, and that people would try to do things to make the relationship more difficult in a sense, and that could spark, you know, negativity and thoughts of, oh, is this relationship going to work, especially being in the public eye. And a quote that I want to mention is, one of the women said, "I was in a relationship for 12 years and never once posted him or talked about him online. We broke up recently and I don't think I will ever post a man." So I think that's another part of why this article has sparked so many debates, is because men can be embarrassing because of how they treat women. And she goes on to say, "I still feel like men will embarrass you even 12 years in, so claiming them feels so lame." And I think a lot of us can relate to being in situations where we aren't put in the best situations with men and they show themselves, and in turn we are embarrassed. And obviously that's not a great feeling, but it's a lesson, I'd say. Personally speaking, I have been embarrassed multiple times by men I've gone out with, and it really made me reconsider the importance of having a boyfriend. Like, yes, having a boyfriend can be rewarding and fun, but it really depends on the intention from both parties, if you get my drift. So, from a societal perspective, the script is definitely shifting. You know, being partnered doesn't affirm your womanhood anymore. It's no longer considered a flex to be with a man. I do believe that this generation of women is embracing more individuality, and I saw one post saying that being single is chic now, and I never really thought of it as chic, but it definitely does enforce the importance of independence as a woman and claiming your own being and not having to be defined by a man, if that makes sense. Obviously, there's no shame in falling in love and being in a relationship, and trying to find love, or trying to make things work. But I feel like now women are rethinking and criticizing heteronormativity, and having a boyfriend is now kind of viewed as something that is fragile. And this concept that we see displayed in the media, it's as if we are public with our boyfriends, or we are, in that light. It does pose a risk of how is this going to pan out. Is this person going to embarrass me? And this is also happening alongside a wave of women reclaiming and romanticizing their single life. And I think that's very liberating to know that being single is not a negative thing, and it shouldn't be viewed that way. And I think because of CHANTÉ's article, we are embracing singleness and not seeing it as something that's negative or I'm trying to find the word and I lost it. But what I'm trying to say is, even there is also this cautionary tale of you'll end up a Spencer with loads of cats, and now that's kind of being more embraced. Like, yes, I'm embracing my singleness. Yes, I am, my own person, and I don't need to be defined by a relationship. And I think the century-old heterosexual fairy tale that never really benefited women to begin with, because it put them in a position of, oh, if I'm alone, if I'm single, then I don't really have anything to live up to in my life, which is not true. And this isn't to say that if you're in a relationship, you can't live up to your dreams or aspirations, but if you are in a season of loneliness and singleness, then it creates a space for opportunity to grow, to chase after your goals, to be ambitious, to have drive, to have passion in your life, and living your life for yourself and no one else. And I believe that's a very powerful message, especially to young women and to women that are trying to figure out what the next step is, or starting over, and maybe starting over without a partner, or feeling a sense of space where you don't really know how you fit into society as a single person, whatever the case may be. It does give women hope that there's more to life than being with a man. Let's just say that. And we see that in the media, whether that's in fiction or in real life. And I want to give a few examples because I actually had an epiphany about a couple, and I was like, oh, that's actually interesting. So one of them being Ariel giving up her life. If you've seen The Little Mermaid, Ariel gives up her life in the sea by giving up her voice to Ursula to be with a man, just for him to briefly leave her for someone pretending to be her. And I never really saw it that way as a kid, obviously, but as I got older, I realized, like, oh, like, that's interesting, that's definitely like a top example that I remember in my head. Another example being in Sex and the City, Big was never Carrie's boyfriend, but she was constantly, chasing after that man and making excuses for him when her friends were like literally telling her, like, oh, Big isn't good for you, like, he doesn't treat you the way you should be treated, and she embarrassed herself for that man just for him not to claim her the way she wanted. And another example I have is, if you've seen the show Friends, Rachel decides not to go to Paris for Ross, again putting her needs to the side in order to be with him, and it does give embarrassing, right? And lastly, this is like no hate, no shade, but Beyonce and Jay-Z. Obviously, we know that Jay-Z cheated on Beyonce, and I think that's an example of men being embarrassing, and she still decided to stand by him. And I just think that's just a very interesting example of how men will literally play in your face and embarrass you. So it's just, I don't know, it's just very interesting how this conversation has opened up a lot of spark and a lot of questions surrounding relationships in general. And I think, speaking personally, though I've never had a boyfriend, I have, dated, and a lot of the time it's hit or miss, mainly misses. And I think one of the common things that I've run into when dating is that men are very calculated, and I'm not speaking for all men, obviously, but I'm saying from experience what I've been through, that they will embarrass you, and it will be intentional, and it's not always the best feeling, but it does give you perspective. I will say that. Yes, the embarrassment is very much an ego bruise, but it does teach the importance of loving yourself and not waiting for someone to love you. I think the first step of wanting to be in a relationship is showing love to yourself and knowing yourself, knowing that I am beautiful, or I am X, Y, and Z, having those affirmations in mind, to a point where it's very solid in your brain, to a point where no one can make you question those things. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do, especially if you've been in situations where people or men have talked down on you or called you out your name or things of that, right? So it's a lot of self-discovery, a lot of learning, a lot of growth happening, and I do believe that it's important to reclaim your individuality. And as our traditional roles begin to crumble, maybe we're being forced to reevaluate our blind allegiance to heterosexuality. And what I find interesting about this article is that it's very much forward thinking as how women think, in terms of thinking above what has been traditionally normalized. And I think that's important to consider, especially in this day and age, especially in our political climate, is being more strategic about how we live our lives, who we let into our lives, and especially in this case, what type of men we decide to have in our lives. And with that being said, I think there's a lot of rethinking, and I think there's also a lot of criticizing as well as to what is right, what is wrong, what seems realistic, what is unrealistic. And it's definitely not a black and white situation, and it's definitely going to be a lot of thought. And I do see myself now becoming hesitant as well in terms of the type of people I want in my life, especially the type of men I want in my life. Obviously, it's been trial and error, but I think now I'm being more selective, a little more picky about who I let access, who I decide to have access to, and who decides to have access to me. And that's going to be a journey. So thank you so much for listening to me talk. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to some of my points. I hope some of the points that I made resonated with you. And I hope to talk to you guys soon. And yeah, bye.